Hello and welcome to Historical. I am your host, Peter Roberts. At Historical, we think your stories are historical. History is a story of you, and they deserve to be recorded and shared. Historical is the place you come to for advice on how to capture life story, tools to use, and how to complete your project. Listen to experts, memoir writers, and product reviews. Let's inspire you to start. Hello and welcome to episode 20 of Historical. Today I speak to Cheryl Svensson. Cheryl is the director of the Birren Center for Autobiographical Studies in Southern California. Through that, she offers classes for people who want to become guided autobiographical instructors. Cheryl is a gerontologist. She got her master's from USC, and she has a PhD in psychology and gerontology. So if you haven't guessed, today's topic is about guided autobiography, which is a process of writing your life story that's built on specific themes. Within each of these themes, there's priming questions that people write their stories about. But the thing about guided autobiography, it's done in a group setting. In usually a class of like 8 people, people stay together for 8 or 9 or 10 weeks, depending how long the class is. So it's a great interview with Cheryl, so let's get started and listen about guided autobiography. Cheryl, thank you for being on Historical today.
Thank you for having me.
Cheryl, can you tell me your job title?
I am the director of the Birren Center for Autobiographical Studies. And through that institute, we offer classes in guided autobiography for people that want to become guided autobiography instructors.
Great. So there's 2 questions there. Tell us about the Birren Institute, and then can you define guided autobiography?
I think we should start with guided autobiography because that's what it's all built on.
Mm-hmm.
Guided autobiography is a process of writing your life story that's built on life themes. And with each theme, there's given a list of sensitizing or priming questions. The students write their stories at home, they come back to the class, and they read the stories in a small group of never more than 8 people. And that 8 people stays the same throughout the duration of the class, which could be 5 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, whatever it is. It's a concept that's created by Dr. James Birren, who lived to be almost 98 years old. If you know anything about the field of gerontology or aging, he was an icon. He attended the very first Gerontological Society of America meeting in 1948. He wrote the very first textbook called The Psychology of Aging in 1964. He started the first school of gerontology in the United States at the University of Southern California in the 1970s. And I met him there in 1975 when I was in the very first Masters of Gerontology program in the entire United States. And he was the founding dean of the school. But of course, I didn't know him. I was a lowly graduate student and he was, quote, the dean. I reconnected with him in the 1990s when he had left USC because they had, quote, retired him. And he went over to the school on the other side of the city, UCLA, where he became the director of the Center on Aging. And at that time, he had already started guided autobiography, which is a story in and of itself, but he conducted the very first guided autobiography class at USC in 1976. And this was done through the Summer Institute, where at that time it was a 2-week session. They met every day for 2 hours. And out of that bare bones beginning, 3 books have been written by Jim on guided autobiography. The last one is called Telling the Stories of Life Through Guided Autobiography Groups. Jokingly, I refer this as the Birren Bible, because with this book, anybody could pick it up and say, okay, I'm going to go start a guided autobiography class. And so Jim had left his role in the 70s where he was a cognitive psychologist studying aging. He was studying the conduction velocity on the sciatic nerve of rats in relationship to age. So he left that and threw himself into this more qualitative life story writing, which was a new field at that time. You have to think back to the 70s. There might have been journal writing was becoming, something to look at, but there was no sense of life story. Jim Birren and his colleague, Dr. Robert Butler, who coined or did the research for the very first life review. He's the one that came up with the term life review. Because at that time, if anybody, older person in particular, looked back at their life or reminisced, it was thought to be pathological. It was thought to be you were beginning to be demented, so you needed to go on from there. So Jim Birren created Guided Autobiography, developed it to consist of 9 themes. The true course is 10 sessions long. And with each theme, there are life themes. The themes go, the first theme is always branching points, because everybody has many different branching points. It could be, a move, a decision that you made, a divorce, a death in the family, a natural disaster, whatever. We have many of them throughout our lifespan. So the first theme is always branching points. The second one is family, the role of family in your life. And then the next one is the role of money. How did you get your ideas about money? If you're like me, I grew up with my mother saying, what do you think? Money grows on trees? It doesn't. We were, I don't want to say poor because I never felt poor, but I knew that there were people that had more money than me. So how did that affect my ideas about money? The next theme is the role of work and life career. And then the themes start becoming more sensitive, if you will. The next theme is health and body image. Were you a healthy child? Were you a child that was chosen to be on the team first, or you were the one that was never chosen? Nobody wanted you to be on their team because you were a klutz, and how did that impact you? And then the next theme is gender identity. And in the book, Jim Birren calls it sexual identity. And even the word sex is so fraught with our Puritan ethics here in the US that I've changed it in all my teaching to be gender. How did you get your ideas about being a girl or boy? I grew up a tomboy. Who were your role models? Those are the questions that go along with the themes. And then the next theme is death and dying. What are your ideas about death and dying? The next one is spiritual life and values. This can be interpreted as religion, if you are religious, or your spiritual life. What does it mean to you, the part of that you can't sense with all 5 senses? What happens next? What happens after you die? The last theme is always goals and aspirations, because Jim always said that, no matter how old you are, you need to have a reason to get up in the morning. So what's your reason? What is it? Mine has become the passion of guided autobiography and teaching and spreading this. So that's what gets me up and going. This is what guided autobiography is. And there's been countless research articles built upon it. It's not a how-to write class. It's not a let's sit down and write our story group. If you started a guided autobiography class with death as the first theme, you'd have half the class at least walk out because they go, whoa, I don't want to go there. So you see that the sensitivity of the themes build up, and it's built up on the process that, you may offer your class in a community college, in a senior center, in your own home, where you build up this trust in the small group. So you might have 20 people in your class, but after that first class, which is the introduction and getting everybody to understand what guided autobiography is, that it's a supportive group of writing your story. It's not a how-to write class. Nobody's going to give you critical reviews. Nobody's going to say, if you added a few metaphors or a little more action, your story would have more meaning. It would be, more exciting for people. Nobody's going to do that, because your story and your voice is what you need to get out. And like I always say, compared to especially personal historians who go in and interview and audio record what their client has to say about their story, and then transcribe it and edit it and add to it and add photos, etc., to make a book. The stories in guided autobiography almost always surprise the people themselves, the students themselves, because they may start out writing their story for their family, a grandchild or an adult child who says, Dad, you got to write that down. Nobody's going to remember those stories, when you're gone. And so he comes to class saying, yeah, my kids told me I had to join this class and write my story. And then by the third class, they're going, you know what? I'm writing this for myself. The kids can have it when I'm dead and gone, or I can edit it and give it to them later. But really, this is for me. So oftentimes the stories that come out surprise even the person writing it, if they can get rid of that critic that we all have sitting on our shoulders saying, come on, you can do a better job than that. Haven't you used that word too many times, or whatever it is? We all have that critic when we sit down and look at the blank page. And the thing that happens in the groups is that the small group of never more than 8, they stay with each other throughout the duration of the class. If it's 8 classes, if it's 10 classes, however many it is. The magic, we call the GAB for short for guided autobiography, because guided autobiography is a complicated, tongue-twisting word to say. The GAB magic happens in the group. You get so you don't want, you're not afraid to read your story because you want to know, what is Martha going to read this week, or how is John going to tell his next story. After reading the story, you get feedback. Now, the feedback isn't, like I've already said, about how to write better, how to be a better writer. It's about, oh, Isabel, what a story that was. If you were very courageous at that time in your life to handle that crisis the way you did. So Isabel may have joined the class saying, as almost all people do, I don't have a story to tell. My story's not worth anything. You should talk to my sister, or, my Uncle Charlie. He really has a story. But once you get in there, Isabel is going to be saying, you know what? I do have a story to tell. Because like Jim Birren always says, there's never been another you. Nobody has, even if you have an identical twin, nobody has the same story you do. That identical twin's story was different. So your story is yours. And I always say, how would you like to have I'm from a family, there were 5 kids in my family. How would you like to have your brother write your story for you? I can't imagine my brother, writing my story. It would be like, oh my God, he didn't know me. So anyway, your story is your own. It's your own unique voice. And in the writing, you use your unique words, whatever that is. So the groups bond. They become strongly connected. I've had one group at Cal State Fullerton that kept meeting for 10 years, and they called themselves the Unguided Autobiography Group. They met in the gerontology director's conference room once a month. They did it until they were too old to keep doing it, until 3 of them had died, and they knew each other definitely better than spouses, and positively better than their adult children knew them, because they shared their stories in such a powerful, continuing way.
Wow. So guided autobiography really is a journey.
It's definitely a journey. And it's a surprising journey for those who undertake it, because they think they're coming in to write their story chronologically. Actually, autobiography is a misnomer. Autobiographical means that you wrote it from the beginning of your life to the point you're at now when you're writing your story yourself. This is more memoir. It's snippets of life. It's looking at, wouldn't I love to know what my mother thought about gender, really? I can remember all the things that she told me growing up, but really, what was her take on it? Wouldn't I love to know what my father, who was killed in a car accident when I was 12, thought about death and dying? I have no idea. And I think that's part of the passion that drives me to do this, is that, as I said, my dad was gone when I was 12. My mother died 10 years later. I really don't know them. I'm half German and half Scotch-Irish. So on my German side, my grandfather came over in the late 1800s to become a Lutheran minister and to attend the seminary. So he wrote his story, his own autobiography. Can't remember how he called it, but it was a typical German name. My Life as Short as Possible, something like that. 2 months before he died. And it was in German. So I didn't know about it. It wasn't until like the 1980s, when somebody on the German side of our family translated it into English, that I got a copy. So I knew my grandfather, who I had never met. All grandparents on my side, my family, were deceased before I was born. I knew more about the grandfather that I'd never met than my own parents. And I realized, what a tragedy. And it's an irreversible one, because I can't go in and ask my mom those questions. So it tuned me to the power of life stories. And then I reconnected with Jim Birren, who at that time, like I told you, was at UCLA. He was writing his book, and we developed a group. We called ourselves the Birren Disciples. There were at one time 12 of us. And we started doing research. We created a DVD capturing Jim Birren, because at that time he was almost 90. So it was like, oh my gosh, he's not going to be with us forever. And he's the founder of this method. So we have a DVD that has him introducing 5 of the themes. So you get a sense that guided autobiography is much more than a simple how to write your story book or course.
You have a way of explaining it in terms of what personal historians do.
Personal historians, to me, get the stories from the outside in, because they go to the client. Oftentimes in guided autobiography groups, you'll have somebody that can write their story from the inside to a certain point, but need help to put it together into a book. So that's where a personal historian would set in, because you can then take those stories, help them add the photos, put it together into a book of some format that they can then give to their families and use as their legacy. Guided autobiography gets a story from the inside out, because the students write their stories that surprise themselves. I have to indicate too that with all of the themes that I mentioned, you're given a list of, we call them sensitizing or priming questions. The questions are meant really just to get you thinking about the topic, and not to answer literally, but to get you thinking about family. Who held the power in your family? Believe me, with a German father, I knew who held the power in the family. There was no question about it. If he said jump, my younger brother and I just started jumping. We never said now or how high or when. So that jumped out at me. If something unusual about your family might attract you. So people are given the questions and they may mull it over and start writing. And they may say, family, I'm going to write about my mom, and you struggle with it and you just can't get going. And finally you throw it up. I've had people tell me this, and you start writing about your younger brother. It's like out of the blue, you realize that your family was you and your younger brother, and you were kind of against the adults and the family was having problems, but you and your younger brother stuck together. So that's the story that comes out. And it surprises you as well. So when else would you get these type of stories? We call it stories from the heart, but it's, stories from your innermost being. And Jim Birren would always say, it's not therapy, because you don't come into a guided autobiography class saying, I've got this problem with my mother. I've got to get over this. You come in and start writing your stories. You may then uncover problems with your mother that then you can write through, but you don't come in with a presenting problem. So it's extremely therapeutic. It's as close to therapy as I can think of. We actually call it transformational learning. And that's what's also kept me going in this, because I see people transform before my eyes. They may come in very shy and hesitant and reticent to speak, and they go out of it becoming volunteers in hospice and traveling on their own and standing up for themselves. In the group that I told you about, the unguided group, 2 of them, they didn't marry, but they became partners, in their 80s. So all kinds of good things can happen when you know the stories of the other people.
Wow. So Cheryl, tell me, who does your classes?
If you're talking about taking a guided autobiography class, it's open to anybody, any age. People say, as actually the question was asked in my training yesterday, what if you don't want to work with old people? Is it only for old people? It's not. When Jim Birren started this, like I told you, was at USC, they were intergenerational classes. They were 4-credit students as well as older adults who were working as volunteers through the Andrus Davis School of Gerontology at USC. The classes, even in the very beginning, ranged in age. I've taught classes at USC that ranged in age from 20 to 80 plus years old. And with that, it was retired faculty along with 4-credit students. So when they told their stories together, because you mix up the groups, I'm thinking of one in particular. One of the gerontology students was a master's student, was going into the PhD program and wanted to go into medicine. And one of the students in the class was the former head of pathology at USC. So she could talk to this student who was worried about taking the it's like the GREs for medical students, med stats or whatever it is, to get into the school. She could talk to her about the kind of questions she was going to be given. She mentored her. So it's a tremendous bonding that happens. And Jim would always say, the more diverse the group, the longer the bonding will take, but the stronger it will be. So if everybody was 20 something, then you can finish each other's sentences for you. But when you have diverse ages, you've got to clarify what you're talking about. And the bonding takes longer, but it's stronger.
How do you do your classes?
I've almost entirely now focused on training other people to teach guided autobiography. So rather than me doing a face-to-face class, which I've done many times, with people that are of diverse ages, et cetera. I've done it at senior centers. I've done it at libraries. I've taught it through community colleges, through extension, there's something called the Osher Lifelong Learning Programs at universities. I've taught it there. I now focus on doing what Jim Birren's legacy was. Jim died at almost 98 years old in 2016. And his goal was to launch guided autobiography. He wanted to take it out to the world. So through the Birren Center for Autobiographical Studies, what I do is teach other people around the world how to lead their own guided autobiography classes in their areas. So my students come to me, I want to be able to go out and teach guided autobiography in my own community. So then you would take my class to learn whatever I do. So my students come to me. A lot of people come to the website. Many have seen the interviews that have been done with me through the New York Times and most recently through the AARP Bulletin. So I get a lot of people that are interested in this. My last class had my first student in Saudi Arabia. I've had students in Australia, New Zealand, all across Europe, South Korea, Japan, mainland China, Taiwan, Sweden, and all across the United States and Canada. My students typically are, unfortunately, 9% male, 91% female. One of the studies Jim Birren always wanted to do was, what happened to the men? Why is it the women that are the forefront of this field? What is it about us, the social connectors that get into life stories and writing that, the men are behind the times? The ages, I have 24% that are under 49 years of age, 32% are 50 to 59, 35% are 60 to 69. So between the late 50s and early middle 60s is the majority of my students. And it's because at that time they're looking at, okay, I'm going to retire from this job that I had to work at to support myself and my family. What do I want to do with the rest of my life? What second career do I want? And a lot of people kind of fall into life stories, the power of life stories. I have one student now who just, when she goes to parties, she's the one that, finds herself talking to the older men and hearing their stories because she loves the stories that they tell, which really is one of the main requirements for this type of work, I think, is liking to listen to stories. And I know for myself, and Jim Birren always said that he learned more in his life by listening to the life stories of others than he did from all of his education. So the group is, not only diverse in age, but they're also highly educated. I have 35% that have a bachelor's degree, 46% with a master's degree, and 18% that have a PhD. So they're usually very highly educated people that come to this from all over the world. They take the training. I teach them in 8 sessions. They're 3 hours each. The first hour of each session, I teach them everything I know about, okay, here's what you need to know to be a good guided autobiography instructor. You need to know about small group process, because if you think you're going to go in as a little professor, forget it. This is a group process. It's built on the group. And you need to know how to work with the group. One of my students, when I, wasn't doing my job and I wasn't, quote, watching the time, that was break time. And he stood up, walked to the front of the class, faced the class, looked at his watch, and walked out the door. He made it clear that I wasn't doing my job, quote, being the group leader and having the break on time. So you're really humbled, but at the same time, you use that group process because then you don't have to have all the answers. Say there's a story read in your group about something you've never experienced. The death of a child upon birth. And somebody in the group knows firsthand what that was like. I'm always amazed how we talked a little bit about the synchronicity or serendipity of life comes in, that somebody in that group will know exactly what they're feeling, maybe having gone through it before or been with a sister or somebody that went through it. And so they know what to say or do when I would have no idea.
Wow. If someone wanted to enroll in a guided autobiography class, would they be able to find one in their area?
On the Birren Center website, we have listed all the instructors by area. So they could go to that place, and it's called, find an instructor in your area. And they can go to there and click on it and find an instructor in Rhode Island, or, who's in Florida and what part. Or they can always email me and I can put it out there. And we have 3 instructors that are teaching classes online. So you could, wherever you are, you could take an online class, which is, it's taught, either through Zoom or WebEx, where it's live video. It's not a pre-recorded video that they're given to understand the class. So I just want to finish up on the difference between teaching someone to be an instructor and a face-to-face class. So the first hour, I teach them everything I know about being an instructor. The second hour, I walk them through each session. Okay, here's your session number 1. These are your objectives for your class. These are the handouts you would give. These are the exercises you would go through. This is, the theme that they're going to be writing on for this class. I do that on the second hour. And then the last hour, because that's the time when my students read their stories on the theme. Because the minimum that you do as a GAB instructor is to have gone through the process yourself. You have to know what it's like to write on that theme. You have to know what it's like to all of a sudden find yourself tearing up on something that when you wrote it didn't bother you at all. But when you started to read it to this intimate group of avid listeners who, believe me, are hanging on your every word, you are humbled and you may start crying, which in my class last night, 3 of them out of the 6 women who read came into tears. They were writing and reading about family, and typically mothers. And as I told you earlier, I'm going to read it now because it's so powerful. This came from one of the students. She said, "I'm surprised by how difficult it was to read my 2 pages. You're exactly right when you said I may know the facts, but not until I had read it out had I connected with the emotional side of the story. I'm grateful to be doing this course. I can say with greater conviction when I run a group that I know how powerful it is." So I know for myself that when my students have gone through this training, and there's now nearly 400, that they will go out and be the best GAB instructor. They're like certified. I have no qualms that anybody is going to, not do a good job teaching it and spreading the word.
You mentioned that more women than men attend classes in guided autobiography. I imagine men would get out of the class as much as women get out of the class.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, as I said that, in my Wednesday class now, I have 3 men. I have one in Portland, Oregon, one in London, and one in Hawaii. So it's like maybe men are now becoming more alert to things like this. And I always give them a choice too, because I'll say, okay, you know what, John, you're the only man in this group. Is that going to bother you? Say, oh, no, not at all. I was raised with sisters or whatever. After a while, the gender differences, you'd think like if you're going to start reading, writing your stories about gender identity, sexual identity, or health and body, that you might, keep yourself from writing too deeply. It doesn't happen. By the time you get to those themes, you forget that that's a man there. I mean, we're just one group. The bonding that happens, maybe it's even stronger when there's a man, because then, and they are sensitive men to begin with, but I've never had an issue with one man in one of my online groups.
What do people do with their writings once they're finished?
I always tell them at least they need to take them and put them into, a document for their own keeping. Like now I say, find stories, you wrote about family. Only one of them sent me a photo. I said, send me the photo. I can put it up while you're reading the story. So if you're talking about, your sister, give us a visual. And then you can, because it's beneficial for us, how visually, carries a lot more weight than just hearing. But also for your own self, when you start putting your stories together, to add those photos, that you've done half the work, you've got the photos out. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's now many ways to self-publish. And the other thing about guided autobiography is you're given a list of 10 questions for each theme. You'd never answer each question. You can go back later and at a different, like I wrote my own 20 years ago. If I was writing it now, it'd be entirely different. Different questions would pop out at me. So you would put it together into one story, based on, the time of your writing. And you can keep it as, continuing, an open-ended autobiography, if you will, or you can publish it.
Cheryl, you called guided autobiography transformational learning. Is that because a transformation takes hold of participants?
It does. There's a feature in guided autobiography that's called developmental exchange. Jim Birren used to give the example of, getting on an airplane. You get on an airplane and you're seated next to somebody and you don't know them, and you say, hi, I'm going to Chicago. Oh yeah, I'm going on to Chicago too. Well, I'm going back to visit my family. I haven't seen them in 5 years. And the other goes, yeah, I'm going back for my sister's wedding or something. And so by the time you give a little bit of information, and you receive a little information, by the time you get to Chicago, you're exchanging phone numbers and you want to go have lunch. You're best friends with this person you didn't know when you started. Transformational learning occurs in the groups because they become so bonded with one another that the barriers to exposing ourselves drop. They become more forthcoming. The stories, as you go through, get deeper and deeper, more revealing. And that's also based on the way the themes are set up. So the first one is branching points. And then you get into things like gender identity and death and dying and, spiritual life and religion as you go on, because the group is so comfortable. And we've done research that shows that in groups, in guided autobiography groups, when we've done pre and post tests using a measure, that measures, this facet of yourself, that after taking guided autobiography, you see more other people more like yourself. In other words, I don't become more like Peta after this conversation, but I see Peta as becoming more like me. Like, oh yeah, you've lived in different places. I've lived in Sweden, you were in Australia, and now you're here, and now I'm here. All of a sudden, and I go, gosh, I'd like to meet Peta for coffee, and sit and have a long chat. So people become more like you. You can call it bonding. It's a connectedness with other people. When you start the class, you're looking at other people and you're going, what am I going to have in common with Marilyn? Look at her. She's only 35 years old. She's just starting life. Here I am, old, by comparison, and going out and, I'm winding up my life. What can Marilyn and I And by the end, you and Marilyn are best friends because it goes beyond the surface. It goes into the innermost human attributes we all share, and you connect on that level. So you become transformed to reach out to other people in a way that you didn't before. You become transformed to try out new things that you might not have felt comfortable doing. Maybe you say, okay, if I can do this class and everybody thinks I'm so strong, surely I can learn Facebook so I can communicate with my grandkids. I can take that cruise alone. I don't want to go alone, but I can do it alone now, and I didn't think I could before. So I see many, many different ways of how it happens, and really it's a beautiful thing to see, because I had nothing to do with it. All I did was create the space for it to happen. And I think that's the beauty of being a GAB instructor. They all think it's me, or but it's really not. It's the process itself that avails itself to this kind of learning and connection with other people. Jim Birren would meet people at conferences that took his class in 1979. They say, Jim, I still remember my small group. I remember the stories. It was the most transformational, experience I had in all of my university days.
People undergo changes that their attitude might change, like the grandmother who was called strong and now she's ready to tackle Facebook. Do you find that people benefit from guided autobiography? And my second question to that is, do they see past events in their life in a different way such that it makes sense to them, or is guided autobiography a way for them to tackle those kinds of issues that maybe were left unresolved, or they never had a different perspective until they talked about it now?
Briefly, yes to everything you just said. And I'll give you two examples. In one class that I taught, there was one student. She's now deceased. Her name was Beverly. She must have been like in her late 70s when she took the class. And she had been married, before the war. Her husband went into the war, came back. She worked as a teacher to put him through law school. They had two boys. She worked to support him while he went on to become a judge. And then he divorced her and married the secretary. Now, we've all heard stories like this. This had happened 35 years before this. Beverly was still dealing with this. Every story she wrote, branching point, he divorced me. Family, I had to support the kids. I didn't have money. Money. There was never enough money because he never wanted to pay alimony. On and on and on. It always came up. Nobody in the group said, Beverly, get over it. It's been 35 years, you're past that. It wasn't until she wrote on the theme of spiritual life and values that she had like this epiphany. She came up to us, my co-leader and I, after the class and said, you know what? We never should have been married. We never shared the same values. We weren't on the same page to begin with. We got married during the war. It's like a light went off in her head, and she realized that she didn't have to live with that anymore. She could let go of it. And Beverly is one who did become a Kaiser Hospice volunteer, after going on. And she also joined the unguided autobiography group I mentioned and kept writing. And then I can give you a very personal story from my own life. I told you, I've done my own guided autobiography and wrote in my group. And I've mentioned my father was killed when I was 12. My mother at that time was 50, and she still had my younger brother who was 10 and myself to take care of. So I wrote my story, and it was like, poor me, which at the time, believe me, it was. It was at 12 years old to lose your father is devastating. I mean, totally devastating. I felt different. I felt, like an outcast. I didn't blame my mother, but I know I was a terrible kid. I must have given her premature gray hairs. Anyway, I said how bad it was for me. One of the other group members, after hearing this story, said, gosh, Cheryl, that must have been so difficult for your mother. I had never in my entire life thought about it from my mother's point of view. Here's a woman who's now got two kids. She had been a stay-at-home mom. She did not drive a car. How was she going to support my younger brother and I, who 12 and 10, through high school? It was like this light bulb went off, and it not only relieved me of, quote, the burden of being the poor me carrying the death of my father all on my shoulders. It really woke me up to my mom, who at that point had been dead for 25 years because she died 10 years after my dad. So, I mean, it was like, I don't know how to explain it any more than it just opened up my world to, it's not all about me, and I guess better late than never. Peter, I mean, it's like, thank God, I finally realized that. All I can say is, oh, Mom, I'm so sorry I wasn't a better daughter.
So it sounds like with guided autobiography classes, people have to open themselves up to both the positive and the negative, or the challenges that they faced in their life.
Yes and no, because with the questions, remember, I'm not looking over my student's shoulder and saying, oh, come on, Marilee, you can write on that topic. I know you can. You look at that question there. It's just the one you've been. Oh, I think there's a level of self-selection. You know how deeply you want to go. How deeply. I've had only one student who, after taking the first introductory session 1, opted out of the class. And she didn't even tell me. She told her friend in the class to tell me that she'd been in therapy for like 10 years after a terrible divorce, and she didn't want to go back there. So I think people know themselves how deeply they want to explore, and the questions are given in such a range that you can be very, I'll say superficial because I don't know what else to use. Easy, superficial question. Who was your role model growing up? Or you can go in, did you ever have any negative sexual experiences as a child? You are given a range of questions from very deep to very easy. Even on the death question, you can write about how, if you're old enough to remember Kennedy, what did John F. Kennedy's death or an important figure's death, how did that impact you? Rather than your personal experiences with losing your father. So everybody chooses their own questions and they decide for themselves how deeply they want to go and how, just surface they want to stay.
And if they want to face those challenges that they've had, or whether they want to talk about the positive things in their life.
Right.
Right.
That's
Okay.
right. And those that have gone through it do grow from it. They go, I'm looking back at some of those negative experiences, and I can't believe how I now have adjusted to it, how I've looked at it with different eyes. Like me, the death of my father, it happened.
That's amazing. And you've written a book.
Yes, my colleague Richard Campbell and I have written a book. Richard is in Toronto, Canada. It was it's called Writing Your Legacy: The Step-by-Step Guide to Crafting Your Life Story. Richard actually was one of my guided autobiography students who became an instructor like 5 years ago. And he had this idea, which sometimes, you get tunnel vision, you're so into it. I kept thinking, well, guided autobiography is a group process, which it is. But he said, Cheryl, look, we can take the themes, the ideas for guided autobiography, and write it into a book so somebody could pick up this book and write their story. You don't need to have a group. Say you're in Anchorage, Alaska, and I don't think I have any instructors in Alaska, and you want to write your story, you can pick it up and write. And so what we did was to take the ideas of the life themes of guided autobiography and write a book that's divided into 3 sections. The first one is anything that personal historians would go through. Why write your story? Why is it important? And just on that topic, Pete, I don't know if you know that, but there's been research done that shows specifically that children who know something about their family, the more children know about the family, the better adjusted they are, the more able they are to cope with, the issues that come up in life. They're more in control. And this is adolescent children. So to me, this is one of the main features that I use to get people to write, especially older people, to write their story. It's not about you leaving this story and thinking, look what all the things I've done. You're leaving this so that your great, great, great grandchildren who will never meet you know something about their family, just like you researching your family roots, will know something about your family, and they will be better adjusted in life, having read that, knowing something about their family. So the first part is why write your story. The second part is, how do you do it? And we introduce the themes and we give you the questions to ask. And then we've included 25 more themes because with 9 themes, you've only started the tip of the iceberg. You have a lot more to write. I tell my students, 20 pages, if they come out with it, your life is more than 20 pages, but you've got to decide if you want to go on or not. And then the part 3 is how to put it together into a book, which is one of the questions you alluded to earlier. What do you do with these stories? Are you going to self-publish it? Are you going to find a personal historian that's going to help you edit it and put it together? Are you going to do a video recording? Which a lot of personal historians do video recordings. What are you going to do with the stories, and where is it going to go, and how are you going to archive it?
Well, that's great.
Yes, it is. It's in second printing, I think, now. We published it 2015.
Pretty much second to last question is, are people surprised, are participants who've been through the guided autobiography, are they surprised at the reaction they get from their family and friends when they share their stories?
Yes and no. I'll give you a personal experience. I wrote my story, and at the time, 3 of my 4 children were old enough to read it. And so I sent it to them, and not one of them said anything about it. Not one of them said, wow, I didn't know that about you, Mom, or gosh, that was something, nothing, zip, and I'm close to my kids. And then one day, my son now, who lives up in Echo Park here in California, he was moving and his computer was out, and I noticed he had a file on his desktop, Mom's Gab. So I know he saved it and he read it, but getting feedback from kids, I have no idea. Oftentimes, but I can tell you that I'm also a gerontologist. So I have my master's degree in gerontology from USC, but my PhD is in psychology and specifically in gerontology. So I go to a lot of funerals because a lot of my friends are old. Right now my oldest friend is 98. And at those funerals, you'd be surprised how many of the family read stories from their parents, their mom or their dad's guided autobiography. They read what they wrote about, spiritual life, or they read what they wrote about death. So it's a treasure for the families, but oftentimes, and I think this may be true even of personal historian work when you present the book, the person themselves are delighted and the family is still thinking, oh, I've got to sit down and read this. Mm. It's a mixed thing, but it's going to be like my grandfather's story. It's, his autobiography is priceless to me. And maybe if I had known him and read it when I was like 12 years old, it wouldn't have meant nearly as much as it does to me now.
Mm. Wow. Well, you've really covered everything guided autobiography today, Cheryl. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for this opportunity, Peter.
Sure. Cheryl, can you tell the audience how they can connect to you after the show?
Now, I think the easiest way is to go to the website, and that's easy. It's Guided Autobiography, oneword.com. There's a space on there where you can find out how to reach out to me, and I will get back to you.
And that's the website where there's a list of other guided autobiography instructors?
Yes, there is.
Right.
Absolutely.
Great.
It's called Find an Instructor in your area. And there's also the EGAB, the 3 that are teaching it online, are listed.
Wow. That's great, Cheryl. I appreciate you being on Storical today.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you for joining me in another episode of Storical. Feel free to let me know how you like Storical, either on iTunes or where you get your podcasts. Or you can email me, Peter, P-E-T-A, at Storical, STORYICAL.com. Never miss an episode by joining us at our website, Storical.com. May Storical inspire you to story the historical, because it's never too soon to get started, but often it can be too late.